It's considered to be the oldest human mummy found intact, and scientists believe he died more than
On September 19, 1991, two German hikers named Helmut and Erika Simon were descending from the Finn-Nailspitz summit in the Ötztal Alps near the border between Austria and Italy. They wandered slightly off the marked trail and noticed something dark protruding from the melting glacial ice below them. They assumed it was mountain debris, maybe equipment abandoned by a previous climber. Maybe, and this is what some hikers apparently hoped for in that moment, something interesting enough to photograph. It was interesting enough. What they had found was a human body, a remarkably well-preserved, face-down human body embedded in a rocky gully at an altitude of 10,500 feet. The initial assumption was that this was a recent tragedy, a modern hiker who had died in the mountains, preserved by cold and ice. The local authorities were called. A recovery operation began, but something about the equipment surrounding the body was wrong. The axe beside him was not aluminum. It was copper. The bow was not synthetic. It was yew wood. The shoes were not Gore-Tex. They were stuffed with grass. By the time forensic investigators and archaeologists arrived, the picture was becoming staggering. This was not a lost hiker from the 1980s. This was a man who had died approximately 5,300 years ago, somewhere around 3,300 BCE, during the Copper Age of European prehistory. They named him Ötzi, after the Ötztal Valley where he was found. And almost immediately, the world could not get enough of him. He was the oldest naturally preserved human mummy ever discovered in Europe. His equipment was intact. His clothing was intact. His stomach contents were intact. He had eaten a meal approximately 30 to 60 minutes before he died, a detail that felt almost unbearably human across 5 millennia. Scientists descended on him. Museums fought over jurisdiction. Austria and Italy had a genuine political dispute about which country owned him, resolved eventually by measuring exactly where on the border he lay. Italy won by 93 meters. Within years, Ötzi had become one of the most studied humans in all of history, living or dead. And in 2012, a team of scientists published what felt like the definitive chapter. They had sequenced his genome. They believed they finally knew who he was, where he came from, and what his life had looked like. They were wrong, not about everything, but about enough things that the story required a complete rewrite. The original story, the 2012 genome study, was genuinely groundbreaking for its time. Using the technology available in the early 2010s, scientists extracted genetic material from Ötzi's hip bone and produced a sequenced genome that told them remarkable things. He had brown eyes, they concluded. He was lactose intolerant. He was predisposed to cardiovascular disease, which was interesting given that he lived 5,000 years before the invention of fast food. He had type O blood. He carried the genetic markers associated with ancestry from early European farmers who had migrated into Europe from Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, several thousand years earlier. His mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively through the maternal line, placed him in a haplogroup called K1, specifically a subgroup that seemed to connect him to populations in Sardinia and Corsica, ancient islands that had, in a sense, preserved genetic traces of these early farmers like biological amber. From all of this, a portrait emerged, a portrait that museums worldwide were extremely eager to render in physical form. Reconstructions of Ötzi appeared in exhibitions across Europe and beyond. He was depicted with pale skin. He had long, wavy hair. He had a lean, weathered face that suggested a hard outdoor life. He looked, to put it plainly, like a slightly tired medieval European farmer who had perhaps been having a difficult harvest season. This image became iconic. It was reproduced in documentaries, textbooks, and science magazines. Children learned about him in school with this image in mind. He was in the cultural imagination a recognizable type of Proto-European ancestor, someone from whom modern Europeans might plausibly imagine themselves descended. The murder mystery surrounding his death only deepened the public fascination. Initial analysis suggested he had been shot in the back with an arrow, the arrowhead lodging in his left shoulder and severing a major blood vessel. He had bled to death or died very quickly from the wound in the mountain gully where he was found. Who killed him? Why? There was evidence of a struggle in the days before his death. He had cuts on his hands consistent with defensive wounds. He had the DNA of at least 4 different people on his equipment, raising the possibility of a violent confrontation. His last meal, red deer, einkorn wheat, and alpine herbs, suggested he had eaten well, perhaps with others, very shortly before he died. The story that assembled itself was irresistible. An ambush, a dispute, a murder in the high Alps 5,000 years ago that we were only now beginning to reconstruct. It was compelling. It was taught as established fact. It filled museum placards and documentary voiceovers with extraordinary confidence. Here is the problem. A significant portion of it was built on sequencing technology that was, by modern standards, limited. And when scientists resequenced Ötzi in 2023 using methods of incomparably greater precision, the portrait did not merely shift. It shattered. The 2023 resequencing study was published in the journal Cell Genomics by a team led by researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. The lead author was Johannes Krauss, one of the most respected ancient DNA specialists working anywhere in the world today. Krauss's team had a significant advantage over the researchers who sequenced Ötzi in 2012, not because they were smarter, but because the tools available to them were simply in a different category entirely. In the 11 years between the 2 studies, ancient DNA sequencing had undergone a revolution. The original 2012 genome had been produced from degraded, fragmented DNA material that required significant reconstruction and inference to interpret. It was genuinely impressive work for its era, but it contained gaps. It contained assumptions. It contained sections where the data was thin enough that conclusions required a degree of scientific faith. The 2023 team used what is called deep genome sequencing, achieving coverage approximately 8 times more complete than the original study. To put that in terms that are actually useful, imagine the first study produced a map of a city that showed the major roads. The new study produced a map that showed every road, every alley, every building footprint, and every garden wall. They also had something else the original team lacked: 11 more years of comparative data from other ancient European genomes. Since 2012, the ancient DNA field had exploded. Hundreds of prehistoric European individuals had been sequenced. A much richer picture of who was living where in Europe and when had emerged. This context was crucial because Ötzi's genome does not tell you everything in isolation. It tells you everything in relation to who else was living in Europe around him, who came before and who came after. And when the team placed the new high-resolution genome into this vastly expanded comparative database, the results were, to use a technical scientific term, astonishing. The first bombshell: his ancestry was completely wrong. Let me be clear about something before I explain this finding, because it requires a small amount of context that makes the bombshell considerably more explosive. When the 2012 study placed Ötzi's ancestry in the tradition of early Anatolian farmers, that fit neatly into the prevailing model of European prehistory. The story went roughly like this. Europe was first populated by hunter-gatherers who arrived tens of thousands of years ago. Then, beginning around 9,000 years ago, farmers from Anatolia migrated into Europe, gradually replacing or mixing with those earlier populations. By Ötzi's time, the thinking went this mixing had been happening for thousands of years, and most Europeans were a blend of these 2 ancestral streams. The 2012 data suggested Ötzi had relatively high levels of this hunter-gatherer ancestry mixed in alongside his Anatolian farmer heritage. He was, in the popular telling, a typical representative of this blended prehistoric European population. The 2023 sequencing found something fundamentally different. Ötzi had almost no hunter-gatherer ancestry at all. His genome showed that he was, genetically speaking, almost entirely descended from Anatolian farmers, with a level of that ancestry so high that it placed him as an outlier even compared to other ancient Europeans of his era. Johannes Krauss's team described it plainly. Ötzi had the highest level of Anatolian farmer ancestry of any prehistoric European individual sequence to date. What this means is genuinely disorienting if you think about it carefully. The 2012 study had essentially misread the proportions of ancestry because the data was incomplete. The sections of the genome that carried the most informative markers about hunter-gatherer versus Anatolian farmer ancestry were precisely the sections where the original sequencing was thinnest. But the deeper implication goes beyond one individual. Because if Ötzi had almost no hunter-gatherer ancestry, it means that in the Alpine region of Europe around 3300 BCE, there were populations living in near total genetic isolation from the hunter-gatherers who had inhabited Europe for tens of thousands of years. The mixing we assumed was well underway by that point apparently had not happened uniformly. Some communities, particularly in alpine and mountainous regions, appear to have been descended almost entirely from a wave of Anatolian farmers, still relatively genetically pure thousands of years after that migration began. And then, in a twist that makes this even stranger, those populations largely disappeared. The genetic profiles that dominate modern Europe, including those of people whose families have lived in the alpine regions for thousands of years, show a very different ancestral composition than Ötzi's. They carry significant steppe ancestry from later migrations of herders from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, people related to the Amnea culture who swept into Europe beginning around 5,000 years ago. Ötzi died, it appears, just before the world he lived in was about to be fundamentally transformed by population movements he never lived to see. He is, in a sense, a genetic snapshot of a Europe that was about to be swept away, a portrait of a world at the last moment before it ceased to exist. That, if I am being honest with you, is one of the most haunting things I have ever had to write. The second bombshell. His appearance was nothing like the reconstructions. Now about those museum reconstructions. You know the ones. The pale-skinned, long-haired, lean-faced prehistoric man staring pensively out of glass display cases from Vienna to Chicago. The Ötzi that school children drew in projects. The Ötzi of documentaries. The Ötzi that became culturally a kind of mascot for European antiquity. He did not look like that. Not even close. The 2023 genome included, for the first time at sufficient resolution to be reliable, analysis of the genetic variants associated with physical appearance, skin pigmentation, hair color and texture, and eye color. The results were unambiguous. Ötzi almost certainly had dark skin, not the olive, slightly tanned skin of the reconstructions, but dark skin consistent with the pigmentation genetics observed in other populations, with very high levels of Anatolian farmer ancestry from this period. Early European farmers, it is now increasingly clear, were considerably darker in complexion than the European populations that came after them. The lighter skin tones common in modern Europeans today developed relatively recently, driven in part by selection pressures related to vitamin D synthesis at higher latitudes, and in part by the genetic influx of those later steppe populations. His eyes were almost certainly dark brown, not the light or hazel tones some reconstructions had suggested. And then there is the hair situation. The 2023 sequencing found genetic markers strongly associated with male pattern baldness. Ötzi, who had spent 3 decades being depicted with a full, if somewhat unkempt, head of hair, was very likely significantly bald. I want to pause on this for a moment because the baldness detail is both scientifically significant and, I will admit, personally amusing to me. Across 5,300 years, the universe has managed to preserve a murder victim in extraordinary detail, map his genome to an extraordinary degree of precision, and the detail that emerges most sharply is that the poor man was going bald. I find that oddly comforting. But the appearance findings carry a serious and important implication that goes beyond reconstructions and museum displays. The image of Ötzi that became culturally embedded was not just scientifically inaccurate. It was shaped, whether consciously or not, by assumptions about what prehistoric Europeans were supposed to look like. Pale skin, light features, a visual grammar that made ancient Europeans legible as ancestors to modern ones. The science was never quite as solid as the confidence behind those reconstructions suggested. And when the genome data becomes richer, the assumptions underneath the image become visible. Those assumptions were wrong. The reconstructions will need to be redone. Some institutions have already begun the process. Others are, shall we say, taking their time about it. The third bombshell: his cause of death gets stranger. You might think that after rewriting his ancestry and his appearance, the resequencing team would have left the murder mystery alone. They did not. The circumstances of Ötzi's death have been studied intensively since 1991. The arrowhead embedded in his shoulder, severing a subclavian artery, had been established as the likely cause of death since 2001, when X-ray technology first revealed it. He bled to death quickly in the mountains. Someone shot him from behind. The question of who and why has never been definitively answered, but the 2023 genome study added a dimension to the forensic picture that previous investigations could not access. Genetic analysis revealed that Ötzi carried markers associated with a surprisingly high genetic load, meaning an accumulation of slightly deleterious genetic variants that tend to appear in populations that have been relatively isolated and small for extended periods. When populations mix, these variants tend to be diluted. When populations remain isolated, they accumulate. This finding was consistent with the ancestral picture. Ötzi's community appears to have been relatively genetically isolated, a pocket of Anatolian farmer descendants in the Alps with limited mixing with surrounding populations. What does this tell us about his death? Potentially more than it first appears. Genetically isolated small communities face particular social pressures. Resource competition becomes acute. Territorial boundaries matter enormously. The cuts on Ötzi's hands, those defensive wounds noted by earlier researchers, combined with the DNA of multiple individuals found on his equipment, now read slightly differently in light of what we know about his genetic isolation. He was not necessarily killed by a stranger from a distant culture. The genetic proximity of the communities in that region, combined with the pattern of the attack, suggests this may have been an intra-community or inter-community conflict between groups that were closely related genetically. A dispute between neighbors, a family feud scaled to prehistoric stakes. There is also this. The 2023 sequencing confirmed that Ötzi had significant genetic risk factors for cardiovascular disease, a finding that echoed the 2012 study. But the new data revealed the extent of these risk factors was considerably higher than previously understood. He was, genetically speaking, a man with a seriously compromised cardiovascular system. He was in his mid-40s when he died, ancient by the standards of his era, heavily armed, physically robust enough to survive at high altitude. But his heart was genetically a ticking clock. Had the arrow not ended his life in the mountains that afternoon, his own biology may have done so within a decade. Regardless, he was a murder victim and a man already living on borrowed biological time. That combination feels, across 5,000 years, almost novelistic. Step back from Ötzi for a moment, because his individual story, as dramatic as it is actually a window into something far larger and more disturbing. The picture of prehistoric Europe that was taught in schools and displayed in museums for most of the 20th century was largely wrong. Not wrong in every detail, but wrong in its fundamental assumptions about continuity, about who lived where, about how populations developed. The old model imagined European prehistory as a relatively gradual process. Hunter-gatherers already here, farmers arriving and slowly mixing, Bronze Age cultures developing from these mixed populations, modern Europeans descending in a relatively unbroken line from all of the above. Ancient DNA research over the past 15 years has demolished this model almost entirely. What actually happened in prehistoric Europe was far more turbulent, more catastrophic in scale, and more dramatic than anyone imagined. The Anatolian farmers who were Ötzi's people arrived in Europe and, in many regions, did not slowly mix with hunter-gatherers. They largely replaced them. The genetic signal of Europe's original post-Ice Age hunter-gatherers fades dramatically from the archaeological record in many regions during the Neolithic period, suggesting population displacement on a massive scale. Then, beginning around 5,000 years ago, the steppe herders arrived from what is now Ukraine and Russia. And they did it again. In many parts of Europe, their genetic signal is so dominant in post-Bronze Age populations that it implies replacement, not gradual mixing. Population movements of a scale that, if they happened today, would define the era. Ötzi caught this process at a specific frozen moment. He was alive in the window between the Anatolian farmer expansion and the steppe herder arrival. He was genetically almost pure Anatolian farmer, living in an alpine pocket that had maintained that ancestral purity for thousands of years. And then that world ended. The people genetically most similar to Ötzi today are not Alpine Europeans. They are Sardinians, still carrying that high proportion of Anatolian farmer ancestry, because the steppe herder wave that transformed mainland Europe arrived in Sardinia later, and less completely. This is what Ötzi really is. He is not just an individual. He is the last photograph of a vanished Europe. A Europe of dark-skinned Anatolian-descended farmers living in mountain communities, speaking languages we cannot reconstruct, practicing religions we can only infer from material remains, managing lives of extraordinary difficulty with tools of copper and wood and grass. That world is gone, and we would not have understood how thoroughly it was gone without the resequencing that forced us to look at it clearly. Here is a question worth sitting with. If the 2012 genome study contained significant errors and gaps, why were the conclusions from that study presented with such certainty for over a decade? This is not a small question. The Ötzi reconstructions built on those conclusions were displayed in major international institutions. The textbook narrative was written with confidence. Television documentaries presented the pale-skinned hunter-gatherer mixed Ötzi as established scientific fact. Scientists, to be fair, do include caveats in academic papers. There are qualifications. There are statements about the limitations of methodology. If you read the 2012 study carefully, you will find the authors acknowledge that their sequencing coverage was incomplete in certain regions. But those caveats do not make it to the museum plaque. They do not make it to the documentary narration. They do not make it to the school textbook. By the time scientific findings pass through the layers of institutional communication that turn them into public knowledge, the uncertainty has been smoothed away. What remains is a story, clean and confident and wrong. This is a pattern that appears across every area of ancient human history examined carefully enough. The Essene theory of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the dolerite pounding theory of Egyptian granite cutting, the neat narrative of Stonehenge as a simple Neolithic religious monument built by simple Neolithic people. In every case, the public story crystallized around the best available interpretation and then stopped updating when the evidence moved on. Institutions, it turns out, are not particularly good at saying they were wrong, especially when being wrong involves replacing expensive museum displays and revising decades of educational material. The Ötzi reconstructions cost significant resources to produce. They exist in institutions that have ownership and pride invested in them. Updating them requires not just money, but the implicit admission that the previous version was misleading. That is an uncomfortable thing for a museum to communicate to its visitors. And so the updates happen slowly, incrementally, quietly, without the fanfare that accompanied the original confident declarations. This is worth being angry about, I think. Not at the scientists who did their best with the tools they had, but at the institutional tendency to present evolving, provisional scientific understanding as settled fact, and then to resist the inconvenience of correction. Ötzi is not alone. The Alps contain an unknown number of additional preserved remains from prehistoric periods. Climate change is accelerating glacial melt at a rate that researchers describe with increasing urgency as a ticking clock for archaeological preservation. As glaciers retreat, remains that have been frozen for thousands of years are being exposed, and then exposed to the elements, and then lost forever if not identified and recovered quickly. Since Ötzi's discovery, several additional significant finds have emerged from alpine ice. In 2003, the body known as Hoslabjak Man was found near a similar location to Ötzi. In 2017, a Bronze Age bow and arrow cache emerged from melting ice in Norway. Across the Arctic and subarctic world, the warming climate is essentially conducting an uncontrolled archaeological excavation, releasing material faster than scientists can process it. What might a future resequencing of additional alpine remains reveal? If Ötzi's genome could be so substantially rewritten by better technology applied to the same individual, what might we learn from individuals we have not yet studied at all? There is also the question of what additional sequencing of Ötzi himself might still produce. The 2023 study was, by current standards, extraordinarily comprehensive. But the history of this field is a history of each generation of technology revealing what the previous generation missed. In 11 years, the tools available to researchers in 2034 will almost certainly be to today's methods what today's methods were to those of 2012. There are questions the current genome cannot answer. What language did Ötzi speak, or what language family was it part of? What were the specific details of his social structure? Who were the people whose DNA appeared on his tools? What exactly was the nature of the conflict that ended his life? Some of those questions may never be answerable from genetic data alone. But some of them, the ones that seemed permanently closed, have a habit of reopening every time the technology improves. The ice is melting, the clock is running, and whatever else is preserved up there in the glaciers of the Alps is either going to be found and studied, or it is going to thaw and decay and be lost within a generation. There is a version of this story that ends with a simple takeaway. Science corrects itself. The system works. We learned more. We updated our understanding. Progress was made. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in the same way the original story was incomplete. The real lesson here is about the gap between what science knows and what institutions tell us science knows. It is about the confidence with which provisional conclusions are presented as permanent truths. It is about the reconstructions on display in museums right now of Ötzi and of countless other ancient individuals that are built on assumptions that have not yet been tested by methods powerful enough to challenge them. It is about the textbooks being used in classrooms today that contain simplified, crystallized versions of scientific understanding that may be a decade out of date. Jeremy Wade spent 9 seasons presenting rivers as thriving and abundant when he knew increasingly that they were dying. Scientists spent a decade presenting Ötzi as a pale-skinned hunter-gatherer mixed Copper Age farmer when the genome data was not robust enough to fully support those claims. In both cases, the available technology was doing its best. In both cases, the institutional communication surrounding that technology was doing something else, presenting certainty where there was uncertainty, and presenting a clean story where the truth was more complicated. Ötzi himself, the actual human being who ate a meal of red deer and alpine herbs and was shot from behind on a mountain in 3300 BCE, deserves better than that. He was a real person. He had a genome that told a real story. And that story includes dark skin, probable baldness, an isolated alpine community of Anatolian-descended farmers, a body genetically predisposed to heart disease, and a death that remains, even now, not fully explained. He was not the pale, long-haired Proto-European of the museum displays. He was something stranger and more interesting and more human than that. A specific individual from a specific vanished world, frozen at the moment of a violent death, waiting 5,300 years to have his actual story told. And even now, even with the most advanced genome sequencing technology currently available to science, we are still only reading part of that story. The rest of it is still in there, in the DNA, in the ice, in the questions we have not yet learned how to ask. That should humble us about every other story we think we know. Because if Ötzi could be this wrong, who else have we been misreading? What other faces on what other museum walls are looking out at us from behind assumptions we have not yet thought to question? The ice keeps its secrets carefully, but it does not keep them forever. And every time it gives one back, the story turns out to be stranger, darker, and more human than the version we invented to replace it. That is why this matters, not just as a correction to one museum display, but as a reminder that the past is not a fixed thing, not a settled story, not a plaque on a wall. It is a living investigation, and the most important findings are almost always the ones that arrive after we thought the case was closed.